Time now for French Connections, our weekly look at the intricacies of life here in France. And this week, the country is marking the 1-year anniversary of the November the 13th attacks, the deadliest terror attacks on French soil. And Florence Villeminot joins me now on set. And Florence, it's time really for the country to take stock and see what's changed.
That's right, Thomas. In many ways, November 13th in France was the equivalent of the September 11 attacks in the United States. Now, of course, the scale was much smaller here, but the psychological effect it had on the country, the traumatic effect it had on the country is very similar. People tend to know exactly where they were on November 13th. You really get the impression that there was a before and an after. It kind of marks the end of a certain insouciance, a kind of carefreeness, a sort of innocence that ended on that night.
And of course, so much has really changed in 1 year, starting with the fact that people in Paris and in the capital have now had to live with fear.
That's right. And immediately after the November attacks, people were quite defiant. They made a point of going out, to continuing their lives normally. This right here, Je suis en terrasse, I am at the Café Terrace, became a defiant rallying cry, as did the relatively unknown motto of Paris, Flux de Atnec, Mergiture, which means tossed by the waves but never sunk. That being said, many French people, particularly Parisians, say that their daily lives have changed. They don't feel as safe as before. And let's actually listen to some people's reactions in the couple days after the attacks.
It's always stressful to be in a closed place, especially for kids.
I avoid public places. I go only when I have to, and when I do, I'm scared.
It's true that now a little bang makes people think of a Kalashnikov, but you can't give in to fear.
And I guess, Florence, what's particular about the November the 13th attacks is that they weren't actually an isolated event.
That's right. France was just starting to heal from the wounds of the January attacks on Charlie Hebdo and the kosher supermarket. Those wounds were really ripped open again on November 13th. And then again this summer with the Nice attacks and the assassination of a police couple and an elderly priest. This repetition means that it's really hard to get back to a normal life. People are on edge. They're worn out. They're bracing themselves for the next attack. Schools, for instance, now carry out drills. You also have the government that has released some guidelines of what to do in the event of an attack. You see these in many public places. In fact, you can see these posters here at France 24. This new constant threat seems to have become the new normal.
And it's easy to forget, but the country is still under a state of emergency and will be until January 2017.
French people have indeed become accustomed to seeing soldiers, heavily armed soldiers, patrolling the streets. Police and the army have been on incredibly high alert. This means that personnel and resources are being stretched out. It's interesting, though, many people have actually been driven to join the reserves out of patriotism.
Given the current terrorist threat, I think it's important to get involved. I'm 17 years old and I just signed up for the military police reserves.
I want to help France in the situation it's in, to be able to assist in any way with what could happen next.
Well, that patriotic jump has been shared by people across France who've rushed to the flag, the national anthem, and to the French motto, Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité.
Many French people indeed feel like French values, like liberté, égalité, fraternité, but also secularism, laïcité. These values seem like they're under attack, threatened, as is our way of life. And this rush to protect those values has gone hand in hand with a bitter and sometimes ugly national debate about identity and what it means to be French. Now, this is perhaps the biggest fallout of the November attacks, a kind of identity crisis here in France. Authorities keep saying we're at war. But who are we at war with? Jihadist terrorists? Thing is, many of them are French citizens, and this specter of an enemy within has put a real strain on social cohesion and this idea of vivre ensemble, living together in harmony. Because one thing that's important to know is that in France, French people tend to be terrified of something called communautarisme. This is a very important word to understand. It is our word du jour. Essentially, communautarisme describes a society where people cling to separate community identities like cultural, ethnic, or religious identities with their own rules and values. Now, unfortunately, this kind of identity crisis that we're seeing has led to a real backlash against Muslims. For instance, this summer we saw the whole burkini fiasco.
Indeed. And Florence, one group has benefited from this whole volatile post-November the 13th attacks, and that's Marine Le Pen's far-right National Front Party.
That's right. And what's interesting is the far right was actually already gaining ground before the November attacks, but it certainly has gotten a boost. The party came out first in round one of regional elections in December, and this has made a lot of people uncomfortable. Is this the new face of France? Is this a backlash of fear? It seems like in the wake of the November attacks, France is being forced to take a good, hard look at itself. And there are some good things. You see volunteers going into schools to teach kids about laïcité, secularism. You also see a certain solidarity amongst citizens. But there's a lot of things that are very hard to look at. And what's interesting is analysts say that France is actually going through the 5 stages of grief, of mourning. You have denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and ultimately you have acceptance.
Okay, Florence Villeminot, thank you very much. That was, of course, French Connections. If you have any other questions you'd like us to answer, be sure to tweet Flo. That Twitter address is @FloVilleminot. And, of course, be sure to check out our previous editions of the show. That's on our website, www.france24.com/en.